Welcome to Module 11. This week we will be discussing South Asia. So here we have the word cloud that was created from the words you submitted on Hartman in the first week of the semester. You can see that most of you thought of India when you thought of the South Asia region. Also, a lot of you thought of such things as population, Buddhism, and Hinduism, things that we'll be discussing this week. Also some physical geography terms such as the warm weather and also the Himalaya mountains. So we're going to discuss some of the physical geography and climate of the region. South Asia is bordered to the north and northeast by the Himalayan mountains. To the south and also southwest as well as the southeast you have the Indian Ocean. To the west of India you have the Arabian Sea, and to the east of India you have the Bay of Bengal. The region is known in the world as being the second densest in population, and also it is surprisingly, despite its high population density, a very rural region and also one that is marked by extreme poverty. As your book discusses, the climate of the South Asia region is highly influenced by the mountains and the seas that characterize it. So what happens, and this is something that is discussed in the book, something that's very important is what's called the orographic effect. And here what happens is wind passes over a surface area, and when it comes into contact with an obstruction such as mountains, and in this case the Himalaya mountains, what happens is the wind goes from a relatively low latitude to a relatively high latitude rather quickly. And what happens here is the air condenses and then precipitation or rain forms. And so you have on the windward side of the mountain range, you have a great amount of precipitation. And on the leeward side or the downwind side, you have little to no precipitation because all of the moisture that was in the air coming on the windward side of the mountain has been taken out and has been dropped on the, you could say, the other side of the mountain. Overall, the climate in the South Asia region typically is marked by cool and dry winters. It's hot and dry from March to June, and typically June to September is what's known as the rainy season. Here we have a figure that shows the monsoon weather patterns that are typical in the South Asia region, and this comes from your textbook. So what happens in the summer monsoon months is that warm, moist air from the south or from the southwest comes across South Asia, particularly the country of India, and goes in a northeasterly fashion. It then collides with the Himalaya mountains and produces a large amount of rain, torrential rain actually, and this can average anywhere from 80 to about 160 inches per year. This of course poses a huge risk of flooding, especially in Bangladesh. But know that importantly that this is also very important for agricultural livelihoods, and agriculture plays a huge role in sustaining the large populations in South Asia and also sustaining the larger national economy. Some of the negative results of catastrophic rainfall from the monsoon season include widespread flooding, property damage, homelessness, which becomes then a chronic issue, also the propagation of diseases and also malnutrition if large amounts of livestock and or agricultural goods are lost. And of course there are large numbers of deaths each year due to the monsoon rainfalls. So next we move on to the political and economic history of South Asia, and know that this is just a brief snapshot of what some of the book talks about, which of course is itself a snapshot of the larger political and economic history of the region. So what I want to talk about with regards to the development of South Asia and primarily the country of India is the importance of the British in the region. So in the late 1600s, the British East India Company, which was one of the largest companies at the time, pushed out the Portuguese in the South Asia region. And in 1690 or so, they established a number of trading posts. In 1773, the British government actually began to control India, and British rule was known as the Raj. And what the Raj did was it instituted social reform, it did build some infrastructure, it established universities, and also established large plantations so as to serve the market, the British market, for the purposes of export. So one commodity that that you are probably familiar with and also may be of interest is tea. Tea was introduced to Europe in the 1600s and early 1700s. It originally came from Japan and China, and its popularity quickly spread. By 1700 or so, about 17 million pounds of tea were being produced yearly. And it's interesting in that the British actually smuggled tea plants and also expertise out of China because the how to grow tea and then how to process tea was a closely guarded secret. So plantations were developed in the South Asia region, in what the region sub-region which is called Assam, and the building of the Suez Canal, which connects the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea via Egypt. Its building actually sped up the transportation of tea from India to Europe and primarily Britain. One of the largest plantations was owned by George Lipton, and of course Lipton tea is one of the most well-known brands of tea around the world, and of course these plantations still exist today. In 1887, India saw the formation of what is known as the Indian National Congress Party. This party was formed to promote greater democracy and freedom from both the British and also traditional princes that ruled parts of India and laid claim to parts of India. Mohandas Gandhi is perhaps the most well-known leader of peaceful independence movement. He would promote fasting and also boycotting, and would always do so in a peaceful manner. India eventually did gain its independence in 1947, and what happened after that created a lot of political and economic tension that to this day continues. So in 1947, when much of the South Asia region was split up, it was done so using what is known as partitioning. What happened was countries were divided along ethnic and also religious lines. So you have the creation of an Islamic administrative district, which is at the time was known as West Pakistan and today is known as Pakistan. Principalities were decided by the princes that ruled them. So for instance, the region that is known as Kashmir went to India because of the prince at the time was Hindu, and so decided to align himself with India, which had a much larger Hindu population than did Islamic West Pakistan. The 1947 independence, like I said, created three countries: India, East Pakistan, and also West Pakistan. East Pakistan today is known as Bangladesh. West Pakistan, as I noted, is today known as Pakistan. This time in 1947 and the years after that created the largest refugee movement ever recorded in the entire world. Fighting amongst groups erupted as they passed one another. So what you had was groups, Hindus and also Sikhs, in West Pakistan fled for India because they felt threatened in West Pakistan. And you had Muslim ethnic minorities fleeing India to go to West Pakistan. East Pakistan did fight for its independence, and India assisted, and this occurred in a war that in 1971 This was the year when Bangladesh was created. And you also have, to this day, you have Pakistan and India, as well as China, continuing to fight over the Kashmir region, which is located in the northwest region of India. Here we have an image that shows the partitioning that occurred. This image is taken from your textbook. Remember that some of the major challenges that occurred as a result of partitioning includes political stability and then also the massive migration of refugees in the years after the 1947 independence movement. So I just want to talk about some of the economic transition that India, which is the world's largest democracy, is undergoing. India is, not surprisingly, the 10th largest industrial sector in the world. In 1992, it instituted reforms to open up the economy to the global market. It has seen in the last few decades a rapid growth in the middle class, and today there are around 300 million or so people who are well educated, sophisticated consumers that make up the quote-unquote middle class in India. However, India is still marked by massive poverty. You have almost 390 million people that are classified as poor and living in India. This, as you may realize, is larger than the entire population of the United States, which is about 310 million people or so. You also have some other South Asian countries that are not doing as well economically and also politically. In particular, Bangladesh is one of the poorest countries in the Asia region. And you have in 1985 to overcome or to at least improve the economic condition of South Asia, the formation of what is known as the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. Next, I want to talk about some various issues affecting the South Asia region. These include population, religion and culture, and also environmental issues. So first, the population. As was visualized in the word cloud for this region, you all noted that population came to your mind when you thought of the region. So it is no secret that the South Asia region has a huge population relative to the rest of the world. Currently, India has the world's second largest population, and this map unfortunately is a little outdated. It's from 2000, but India's population now is around 1.2, 1.3 billion people. You'll note that Pakistan, according to this map, has the sixth largest population, and Bangladesh is close behind with the world's seventh or eighth largest population. So together, this region, which is shown in yellow, is one of the has the world's one of the world's largest populations relative to the other world regions. So in the region as a total, there are more than 1.3 billion people. This makes up about 1/6 of the global population, and it is the second largest group, only behind China and parts of East Asia. It is the fastest growing, so it has the highest birth rate of any of the regions in the world, and also has some of the highest population densities throughout much of the region. It is marked by a number of good agricultural regions, which also have relatively high population densities, and these are mainly located along rivers and also coastal areas, and then south of the Himalayan mountains. It is, however, a mostly rural region and has about 50, despite it being a mostly rural region, it has about 50 cities that have more than 1 million people in them. Here we have a population pyramid for India, specifically over time. In 1950, you can see that there was a large percent of very young people in the population and had a relatively low life expectancy, so that's why you have the smaller horizontal rows toward as you increase, going from the lowest age, 0, to about 80 or 90, which is shown on this graph. In the year 2000, you see that the population pyramid is evening out a little bit. So you have people that are living longer, and then also you have people that older people are making up a larger percent of the population relative to younger people. And in 2050, the United Nations expects that the population of India will be much more similar throughout over the ages. So from the ages of 0 to about 60 or so, they expect that that the population will be rather uniform, that there will be equal representation of all of these ages in the population of India. Because of the large population of India, there have been a number of population policies put forth. The government of India realizes that resources are already severely taxed, so just as we saw in Latin America and in other regions of the world, there is typically a large migration going from rural areas to urban areas, so this puts a tax on urban areas in particular, where, for instance, we saw a couple of slides ago, there are hundreds of millions of people in India alone that are living in poverty. So this puts pressure on social services and also the physical infrastructure in urban areas, let alone in rural areas, which are sometimes very difficult to reach. So India, beginning in the early 1950s, began a number of population policies. However, these were not successful. In the 1970s, the Indian government used coercion to promote and to force upon people population policies to try to reduce the population growth of the country. It relied on punishments and also coerced or forced vasectomies. There was, of course, a large public backlash to these, and so to this day people remain distrustful of family planning programs in India in particular. And as is the case throughout much of the world, India is largely a patriarchal society. So what this means is that it is a typically male-dominated society, and as a result, women in the household are often barred from receiving education or have lower education relative to men. They also have lower status and lower wealth, and a number of development programs within India and then also throughout the world have shown that when females are educated, when their status, social status, and also wealth increase, that there is a lower birth rate. Typically, this is what happens. And so we're seeing in India and throughout much of the world an emphasis on educating women. Just want to talk a little bit more about population. Here we can see what is known as the South Asian diaspora. So you have 5 to 6 million South Asians who live in Europe, parts of Africa, and then also North America. There was a demand for cheap labor after abolishing slavery in the world, and so you have a large number of South Asians going to different parts of the world to fulfill a need for cheap labor. Unfortunately, this map does not show you, especially here in the 21st century, the number of Asians, the large number of South Asians going to parts of the Middle East, where I mentioned in previous lectures the important role that South Asians are playing in building, for example, football stadiums in Qatar or Qatar, which will be hosting the World Cup in about a decade or so. We also see in the South Asian diaspora what is known as a brain drain. So you have a lot of very intelligent people leaving India to pursue higher education, first in Britain and then also in the US and also parts of throughout Europe. Next, I want to talk about major religions in South Asia. So as we have learned in previous modules, a cultural hearth is an area from which great cultural meaning and projects emanate from a certain region. And so we have a cultural hearth in what is known as the Indus River region or valley. The Indus River is located in Pakistan, and we'll see that in the next slide. So, just discussing some of the major religions in South Asia. This map shows their distribution. We can see that Afghanistan and Pakistan are largely Muslim countries. India is largely Hindu. Bangladesh is also Islam, like Pakistan and Afghanistan. And you have smaller or lesser well-known religions such as Jainism and also Sikhism being dotting different subregions of India, and then also Nepal and Bhutan and Bangladesh. And then also you have some Christianity that is prevalent in the region. Just wanted to talk a little bit more about Hinduism because this is a religion that not a lot of folks know very much about. It is the world's oldest religion, and it dates to the Indus River, which here is visible in the map. It diffused south and then also east down the Ganges River, which is located in the right-hand side of the map and begins or flows through the northern part of India. Hinduism absorbed and eventually supplanted earlier native religions and customs which were found throughout the South Asia region, particularly in India. And it has different forms in India, Sri Lanka, and Nepal. Hinduism is not just a religion, rather it represents an intricate web of religious, social, philosophical, and also artistic elements. Unlike Christianity and Islam, it does not have a single moral or strict moral code. Also, there is no direct divine revelation involved. Some of the major tenets of Hinduism include reincarnation, which means that all living things have souls, and also that souls move to another creature at death. A second tenet is karma, which means that every action brings about certain consequences, and also that good behavior is rewarded in the next life. And the third major tenet is dharma, or a set of rules to be followed to move up the ladder of reincarnation or upon reincarnation. There are three basic principles in Hinduism, the first being puja, or worship, the second being the cremation of the dead once a creature does die or a person does not, and also the third being the regulation of the caste system. So the caste system is an important part of the culture in India. A caste includes grouping by kinship. Jati, which is less well recognized or understood by U.S. students typically, is grouping by language, region, and also occupation. So in the caste system, one is born into a caste, and there are norms of interactions that are expected between classes and among class members. At the very top of the caste pyramid, you have Brahmins, which include religious leaders and also the learned. They are the most highly regarded in the caste system. And at the bottom, you have untouchables. More than 138 million people out of India's population, which is more than 1 billion people, make up the untouchables class. You should know that attempts have been made to alleviate the conditions of untouchables. However, despite these political measures, there is still a large percent of the population that goes by the caste system, and so you have discrimination continuing throughout much of India. In India, language makes up a major part of the culture. There are more than 1,600 different languages that are spoken in India, in the South Asia region. You have four major families: the Indo-European group, the Munda group, Dravidian, and also Tibeto-Burmese. Here we have a figure from another geography textbook that shows the distribution of some of the languages found throughout India, and also the approximate population approximate number of people in India that speak the language. So you have Hindi, which is not Hinduism. Hindi rather is a language, being the most often spoken language in India, with more than 300 million people. Second is the Bihari, and then a close third is the Marathi language. In contemporary culture, much is increasingly we know more and more about India, and we see the prevalence of Indian culture here in the United States. As I mentioned before, in India there is a large middle class. The most well-known sport and most popular sport in India is cricket. And cricket, of course, has its influences in the Western European countries as well as throughout other regions in Asia. Bollywood, which is India's movie industry and is very similar to Hollywood in that sense. Typically, it promotes traditional values, values that are traditional in Indian culture, and is the largest movie industry in the world, producing, that is, in the number of films that are produced annually. But the amount of money that it generates is still less than what is generated by Hollywood. And increasingly you see culture, as I mentioned, being exported from South Asia to the rest of the world. Here in the U.S., in certain areas of the U.S., you see an increase in mysticism and also yoga, of course, and then also food. Indian restaurants are very popular here in the U.S., and also curry itself is very popular. I'm going to talk just briefly about urbanization. I did mention before that most of the South Asia region is rural. About 75% of the region is rural. In Afghanistan and Bangladesh and also Sri Lanka, about 77% of the country is rural. In India and Pakistan, the number is still high, but a little bit less. In 2010, as I mentioned before, there were more than 55 cities that had at least 1 million residents. Mumbai is the largest city in the region. It has a population of more than 20 million people. Because of the high rates of poverty in the South Asia region, there is a high prevalence of shanty towns. Here we have a graph provided by the World Bank, and this dates from 2006. It shows that whereas the percent of total population for South Asian countries living in urban areas is relatively low in 2005, it is expected to grow tremendously over the next 40 or so years up until 2050. Many countries are going to go from anywhere from 15 to 35% urban to anywhere from like 30 to more than 70% urban. So we can expect to see major shifts occurring, migration shifts, and then also shifts in how resources are allocated and how governments are able to respond to the needs of rapidly growing urban areas. As I mentioned before, poverty is a huge an issue of great importance in South Asia. You have high amounts of illiteracy and then also destitution. Hundreds of millions of people alone living in India who are poor, but then also in Pakistan and Bangladesh, among other regions. You have rural areas which still to this day lack basic infrastructure because of lack of economic resources in the countries, and then also remember that some of these areas are difficult to get to. You have, because of poverty and lack of formal economic jobs, you have a large informal economic sector, and some of the social and also labor issues that we have seen in the news of late has been inadequate building and then also inadequate labor regulations, especially in Bangladesh, where a garment factory collapsed in 2013, killing more than 1,000 people. This has raised awareness throughout the world, but it remains to be seen whether or not some new and binding regulations will be implemented in these countries so as to protect the populations that work in factories and also to promote a more sustainable economic system in those countries. I want to talk just briefly about inequality and gender issues. As I mentioned before, the South Asia region largely suffers from being a patriarchal society, meaning that women are at a disadvantage in comparison to men when it comes to education, wealth, things like that. Also, as a result of this, women suffer poverty. They are most likely to suffer from poverty, and also women are they perform most of the work despite being lesser educated, also having few property rights, if any. Sometimes they are barred from owning property. In many South Asian countries, women, their behavior is restricted in public. And in India, unfortunately, among other places, we see what is known as bride burning or dowry deaths, when the family of the bride is unable to pay a certain dowry, then sometimes the woman will be abused and in worst case scenarios will be killed. You do have a increase in the number of self-help movements, and we'll talk about that in a second, and this occurring throughout the region. Children are unfortunately even worse off than women are, and women are very bad off in this country, in this region. You have approximately 15 million children who are in bonded labor or modern-day slavery in this region of the world. So there is one movement that has increased the economic standing and also social standing of women in the South Asia region. This is a result of the work being done by the Grameen Bank. The Grameen Bank was started in 1976 in Bangladesh by Muhammad Yunus, who is an economics professor and to this day still resides in Bangladesh and works there as well. The Grameen Bank was developed into an independent bank in 1983, and what it does is it specializes in microcredit and also microfinance lending. So it will give relatively small loans to women, and women work in groups. Sometimes about 15 to 20 women are in a group. Money is given to each woman in the group, and then women are expected to invest in a small business of sorts. They then, over time, repay the loan, and if a woman in a group is unable to repay the loan, then the other members of her group are expected to help her out and to repay her loan. So it is a profit-making venture. However, it does have a strong, it is very good at promoting the empowerment of women because it works with them directly as opposed to going to their husbands or their brothers or their fathers, something like that. There are 12,000 employees in the Grameen Bank. A typical loan is only about $120, but this can make a world of a difference. And as I mentioned, the vast majority of borrowers are women, and the Grameen Bank is something that has been replicated throughout the world. For example, I do research in Nicaragua in Latin America, and I have encountered numerous examples of women participating in microfinance and microcredit lending there in Nicaragua, and this is modeled after the Grameen Bank. And as a result of his work with the Grameen Bank, Muhammad Yunus was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2006. There have been a number of environmental issues that I wanted to point out in the South Asia region. So overall in the region you have relatively weakly enforced environmental laws, and each year approximately $14 billion is lost as a result of environmental degradation. In 1984, you have the Bhopal disaster. Union Carbide, which is a U.S.-owned chemical manufacturer, has a plant in India, in the city of Bhopal, which is in India, and this plant released poisonous gas, which killed about 4,000 people and actually injured, disabled, or maimed about 40,000 people. You also have, due to poor planning on the part of governments in South Asia, and also on the part of development banks throughout the world, you have a number of environmental issues. So one issue would be the Tarbela Dam, which is located along the Indus River in Pakistan, ruining mangrove forest, and mangroves are very important to the local ecosystem. One result is that fish stocks have been nearly depleted, which you can imagine that fish is very important, especially given how rural parts of South Asia are, and so fish does represent a very important source of livelihood. Another example of poor planning is that tube wells, which supply water, which are drilled, and then consequently they are drilled to supply water, are contaminated with arsenic. So what happens is international development agencies did not recognize the risk of drilling tube wells that were not deep enough, and so you have millions of people that have been poisoned by arsenic, and this has very immediate effects, but then also effects on health that will go on for many generations. And this has been particularly bad in Bangladesh. The Green Revolution itself is the successful development of higher yield, fast-growing varieties of rice and also other cereal grains in developing countries. The U.S. and also the United Nations promoted the Green Revolution beginning in the 1960s. The World Bank, since this time, has provided loans so that appropriate technology could be purchased, and this is technology purchased by individual farmers and then also the various governments throughout South Asia. The Green Revolution came to be as a result of focusing on the food crisis and worries about overpopulation in the South Asia region. It does increase, or it works to increase production per unit area of miracle crops. Also, it promotes new irrigation systems and also the intensive use of fertilizers. And overall, what you have as a result is increased dependency on seed, on irrigation, and then also the use of fertilizers and also pesticides. Some of the problems that have come about as a result of the Green Revolution have been increased inequality in the region. You also have increased environmental degradation because fertilizers and also pesticides are being promoted at exorbitant rates. And also, unfortunately, last but not least, you have farmer suicide. So you have hundreds, if not thousands, of people who have committed suicide as a result of not being able to repay their loans because crops have failed,